How well do you actually know the person sleeping next to you? I used to think I knew my husband better than anyone. I knew how he folded his shirts. I knew he hated cold coffee. I knew he always checked the locks twice before bed. And for 12 years, I believed those little habits added up to a man I could trust. Then I found a handwritten list.
A list of names. A list with dates. A list with plans. And at the very top, circled in red ink, was my mother's name.
What shattered me wasn't the possibility that my husband wanted someone dead. It was realizing he had been planning it for years while eating dinner across from me every night. I didn't call the police. Not yet. Not yet. Because I needed to know one thing first. Was this some kind of sick fantasy? Or was I sharing a bed with a man preparing to become a killer? What happened next forced me to question every memory of my marriage. And when I finally got the truth out of him, it happened on a live feed he never knew was running.
The day everything changed started with dust. Not danger. Not fear. Dust. The kind that settles into your hair and clothes during home repairs. My husband, David, had been talking about renovating our master bedroom for months. The house was old. Nearly 70 years old. And every winter the floor near our bed creaked loudly enough to wake us both. By early spring I finally agreed it was time to fix it. Nothing about that Saturday felt unusual. The morning sunlight spilled through the bedroom curtains. A podcast played softly from my phone. Outside, our neighbor was mowing his lawn. Normal sounds. Normal life. The kind of day that gives you no warning before it destroys everything. David had left early for a fishing trip with coworkers. I stayed behind to start clearing furniture out of the room. By noon, the mattress was leaning against the wall. The nightstand sat in the hallway. The room looked strangely empty. Like a stage after the actors leave. I remember standing barefoot near the foot of the bed when I heard it. That familiar creak. Louder than usual. I pressed my weight onto the floorboard again. The wood shifted slightly. Not much. Just enough to catch my attention. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the seam. Something felt loose. At first I assumed it was water damage. Old houses hide surprises. Usually expensive ones. I grabbed a pry bar from the garage. A decision so small I still think about it sometimes. Because if I had ignored that floorboard, if I had decided to wait for David, my life might look very different today. The board lifted easier than expected. A small cloud of dust rose into the air. Underneath was a shallow cavity between the floor joists. At first I saw nothing unusual. Just old insulation. Cobwebs. Then something dark caught my eye. Tucked carefully against the wood. Hidden intentionally. My stomach tightened. I reached inside. Pulled it free. And found a leather-bound ledger. Worn at the corners. No title. No markings. Just a thick notebook secured with an elastic band. I remember sitting cross-legged on the bedroom floor staring at it. The room suddenly felt quieter. The podcast had ended. The lawnmower outside had stopped. Everything seemed unnaturally still. As if the house itself was waiting. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Old financial records. Family documents. Something boring. Something harmless. I opened the cover. The first page changed everything. There were names. Dozens of them. Written neatly. Carefully. Each name followed by notes. Dates. Locations. Observations. At first, my brain refused to understand what I was reading. The words were clear, but my mind rejected them. Like looking at a photograph that couldn't possibly be real. Then I turned another page. And another. The notes became more detailed. Disturbingly detailed. Descriptions of routines. Schedules. Habits. Places people visited regularly. Private information. The kind you collect only when you're watching someone closely. Very closely. A cold sensation crawled through my chest. I stopped breathing for a moment. But I recognized the handwriting. I had seen it thousands of times. Birthday cards. Shopping lists. Anniversary notes. It was David's. Without question. Without doubt. David had written every word. My hand started trembling. The ledger slipped slightly in my lap. I kept reading. Unable to stop. Terrified to continue. The names weren't random. Some belonged to former coworkers. One belonged to an old neighbor. Another belonged to someone David used to complain about years ago. People from different periods of our lives. Connected only by him. Then I reached the page marked with a red circle. The ink looked newer. Darker. More deliberate. My eyes locked onto the name. And the world tilted. Margaret Lawson. My mother. I stared at the page so long my vision blurred. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe there was another Margaret Lawson. Maybe this was coincidence. Then I saw her address. Her birthday. The church she attended every Sunday. The coffee shop she visited after service. Information only someone familiar with her would know. My mother wasn't simply on the list. She was at the top. Highlighted. Prioritized. Studied. The ledger slid from my hands onto the floor. I felt suddenly cold despite the warm afternoon. My chest tightened. Not from panic. From disbelief. Because my mother and David weren't enemies. They weren't even close. They were polite. Friendly. Ordinary. The kind of relationship that never attracted attention. Yet someone had circled her name in red. Someone who slept beside me every night. Someone who kissed me goodbye that very morning. I wanted to call her immediately. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to drive somewhere and never come back. Instead, I sat alone in the middle of that empty bedroom. Surrounded by dust and exposed floorboards, listening to the silence. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, I became afraid of my husband. But what terrified me most wasn't the ledger itself. It was realizing there was one section I hadn't opened yet. A section labeled Final Preparations. And buried beneath those pages was a truth that would force me to question whether David's target had ever really been my mother at all. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the ledger. 5 minutes. Maybe 30. Time felt distorted. The afternoon sunlight had shifted across the bedroom floor, turning the dust particles gold. My hands were cold. My thoughts weren't. They were racing. Trying desperately to find a reasonable explanation. Because reasonable explanations are comforting. And comfort was the one thing I needed. I opened the section labeled Final Preparations. The handwriting remained neat, controlled, and methodical. That somehow made it worse. Messy people make mistakes. Careful people finish things. The first page wasn't a plan for violence. It was a timeline. A detailed schedule. Weeks. Months. Specific dates. Appointments. Meetings. Travel windows. Expected routines. Every line looked more like project management than obsession. That realization sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Because it suggested patience. Preparation. Intent. I turned another page. There were photographs. Small printed photographs taped carefully beside handwritten notes. Some showed houses, parking lots, church entrances, coffee shops, places that meant nothing to me until I saw the address beneath one image. My mother's church. I dropped the page. My pulse hammered in my ears. The room suddenly felt too small. Too hot. I stood up and paced across the bedroom. Back and forth. Back and forth. Trying to think. Trying not to panic. Trying to understand why. That question kept repeating itself. Why? David wasn't a reckless man. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't known for losing control. Friends trusted him. Neighbors liked him. Even my mother often described him as dependable. So why would her name be there? Why would anyone's name be there? Then I found something that made me stop walking. A folded piece of paper tucked between two pages. Unlike everything else in the ledger, it wasn't handwritten. It was printed. A financial document. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Then I recognized the account numbers. Joint accounts. Family assets. Insurance policies. Property information. My property information. I sat down again. Slowly. Reading every line. The names listed as beneficiaries. The ownership structures. Transfer instructions. Changes that had been researched but never finalized. At least not yet. And suddenly the ledger looked different. Very different. The names. The timelines. The observations. Everything seemed connected to one thing. Money. Not emotion. Not hatred. Money. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it frightened me even more. Because anger can be impulsive. Greed can wait forever. Greed can smile at you for years. Greed can celebrate anniversaries. Greed can hold your hand at funerals. Greed can sleep beside you. And never reveal itself. The front door opened downstairs. I nearly screamed. For one terrifying second, I thought David had returned early. I shoved the ledger back into the floor cavity. My heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then I heard a familiar voice. My daughter. Emily. Home from work. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by guilt. Because I couldn't tell her. Not yet. I wasn't even sure what I had found. And if I was wrong, I could destroy our entire family. That evening felt unreal. David came home around 7. Sunburned. Smiling. Carrying fishing gear. The same man who had left that morning. The same face. The same voice. The same laugh. But everything had changed. At least for me. I watched him unload equipment in the garage. Watched him kiss my forehead. Watched him ask what I wanted for dinner. And every ordinary gesture felt like a performance. Or maybe it always had been. I no longer knew. That uncertainty was the worst part. Not knowing which memories were real. During dinner, he told stories about the lake. Emily laughed. The television played quietly in the background. Our family looked completely normal. But I couldn't stop studying him. Looking for cracks. Looking for signs. Anything. And that's when I noticed something strange. Not what he said. What he avoided. Every time my mother's name came up, even casually, his expression changed. Only for a second. A tightening around the eyes. A pause before responding. Tiny things. Things I never would have noticed before. Now they seemed enormous. Later that night, he fell asleep beside me. Almost instantly. As always. I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the ceiling. Listening to his breathing. Wondering whether I was imagining everything. Wondering whether the ledger was evidence of a crime. Or evidence of something else entirely. Then around 2 a.m, David's phone lit up on the nightstand. A message preview appeared. Only 6 words. But they changed everything. The camera installation is complete. My blood turned to ice. Camera installation? What camera, Elle? What installation, Elle? And why had that message arrived at 2 a.m? I waited until he rolled over. Then carefully picked up the phone. My hand shaking. The message came from a number with no saved name. There was no conversation history. Nothing. Only that single message. As if earlier messages had been deleted. Deliberately. The next morning, after David left for work, I drove directly to my mother's house. I didn't tell her why. Not at first. I just needed to see her. To know she was safe. To know she was real. She opened the front door carrying a watering can. Completely unaware that her name had been circled in red inside a hidden ledger. Seeing her smile nearly broke me. Because she looked vulnerable. Human. Ordinary. And suddenly the possibility of losing her felt terrifying. While we sat drinking coffee in her kitchen, she mentioned something odd. Something she considered harmless. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. A man had recently been asking questions around the neighborhood. Nothing alarming. Just casual conversations. Friendly conversations. Asking who lived nearby. Who attended church regularly. Who traveled. Who lived alone. The kind of questions people forget. Unless they already know what they're looking for. I drove home feeling sick. The pieces weren't fitting together. They were multiplying. And every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Then I remembered the message. The camera installation. And suddenly I knew exactly where I needed to go next. Not the police. Not yet. The place hidden in the ledger. The address listed repeatedly beside several names. A small storage facility on the edge of town. Because whatever David was hiding, I was beginning to suspect the ledger wasn't the whole story. It was only the index. And the real secret was waiting somewhere else. By the time I parked outside the storage facility the following afternoon, I had no idea that opening that unit would reveal something far more disturbing than a list of names. Because inside that metal door was proof that my husband hadn't just been watching my mother. He'd been watching me. For years. The storage facility sat on the edge of town beside an abandoned furniture warehouse. Nothing about it looked unusual. Rows of metal doors. Chain link fencing. Security cameras mounted on tall poles. The kind of place people use when they run out of space in their garage, or when they need somewhere to hide things. I parked 3 buildings away. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't immediately unfasten my seatbelt. For a moment I considered leaving. Driving home. Pretending none of this existed. Pretending I had never lifted that floorboard. But once you see something like that ledger, you can't unsee it. The unit number appeared 3 times throughout David's notebook. Always underlined. Always referenced beside coded notes. That alone told me it mattered. A lot. I waited until the office clerk stepped outside for a cigarette. Then I walked in. Trying to appear calm. Trying to look like a wife dropping off paperwork. Instead, I felt like someone sneaking into her own nightmare. The woman behind the counter couldn't have been older than 25. Friendly. Distracted. Scrolling through her phone. I showed her a photograph of David. My husband rented a unit here. He asked me to pick something up. A lie. A simple one. The kind people rarely question. She typed for a few moments, then nodded. Unit 314. My stomach dropped. It existed. Which somehow made everything worse. Do you need the access code? She asked. I froze. For half a second. Then smiled. Please, She wrote it on a sticky note. Without hesitation. Without suspicion. Without realizing she had just handed a stranger access to the darkest secret of my marriage. 10 minutes later, I stood in front of Unit 314. The metal door looked ordinary. Dusty. Sun-faded. Quiet. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it suggested obsession. Nothing about it suggested betrayal. And yet my pulse was racing. I entered the code. The lock clicked. My hand rested on the handle. Suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted answers anymore. Answers have consequences. Questions still allow hope. But eventually, throw the door open. The smell hit first. Paper. Cardboard. Old dust. Nothing sinister. Nothing dramatic. Which somehow felt more unsettling. Because evil rarely announces itself. Most of the time it looks ordinary. That room was proof. Shelves lined the walls. Plastic containers up. File boxes. Stacked binders. Everything organized with almost obsessive precision. Every box labeled. Every folder numbered. Every shelf categorized. The space looked less like storage and more like an archive. A private archive. Built over years. Maybe decades. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and started reading labels. Property records. Insurance files. Financial transfers. Legal correspondence. Travel logs. The titles alone made my chest tighten. Because they mirrored sections inside the ledger. like extensions of the same project. The same system. The same obsession. Then I saw a box labeled family. My hands instantly went cold. I opened it. Inside were hanging folders, each marked with a name. My father. My mother. My daughter. My sister. Even me. Especially me. For several seconds I simply stared. Unable to move. Unable to process what I was seeing. Because nobody creates folders like that casually. Nobody spends years documenting family members without a reason. At least not a healthy one. I pulled out my folder. The thickest one. By far. My knees nearly buckled. Hundreds of pages. Medical records. Employment records. Travel itineraries. Bank information. Photographs. Copies of emails. Phone logs. Receipts. Notes. Years and years of notes. My entire adult life reduced to paperwork. Cataloged. Organized. Studied and then I found the photographs. And that's when real fear arrived. Not anxiety. Not confusion. Fear. The kind that settles into your bones. The kind that tells you something is fundamentally wrong. The photographs weren't family pictures. They weren't vacation memories. They were surveillance photographs. Taken without my knowledge. Dozens of them. Hundreds of me entering grocery stores. Leaving work. Meeting friends. Walking my dog. Filling my car with gas. Sitting alone at outdoor cafe. Moments I never knew anyone was watching. Moments I thought belonged only to me. I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The room suddenly spinning. Because every photograph answered one question. While creating another. How long, Elle? How long had this been happening? 5 years? The entire marriage? And then I found dates. The earliest photograph had been taken 8 months before our wedding. 8 months. Before our... I stared at the timestamp again. Certain I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. David had been documenting me before we were married. Before we shared a home. Before we built a family. Before I believed he loved me. For the first time, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if the marriage itself wasn't the beginning? What if it was part of the plan? Elle. A loud metallic sound echoed outside. I nearly screamed. Footsteps. Close. Very close. Someone walking between units. My heart slammed against my ribs. I remained completely still. Listening. Waiting. The footsteps passed. Then disappeared. But the fear remained. Because suddenly I realized something. If David visited this place regularly, he might come back. Anytime. Any day. Maybe even today. I stood quickly and began photographing everything. Every box. Every file. Every photograph. Every page I could find. My phone storage filled rapidly. But I couldn't stop. I needed evidence. I needed proof. Because nobody would believe this story without it. Truth that sounds impossible usually needs documentation. Fortunately, David had documented everything. Then I noticed something hidden behind the final shelf. A locked metal cabinet. Unlike everything else in the unit. No label. No markings. Just a heavy gray cabinet secured with a small padlock. The only thing in the room that wasn't easily accessible. Which meant it was probably the most important. Beside the cabinet sat a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. And immediately wished I hadn't. It was another list. Shorter than the ledger. Only 5 names. 5. My mother's name was there. Again. But this time she wasn't first. I was. My name occupied the top position. Circled. Underlined. And beside it were 3 words that stole the air from my lungs. Phase 2 begins. I don't remember leaving the storage unit. I don't remember driving home. I only remember sitting in my car outside my house, staring through the windshield, trying to understand one horrifying reality. The ledger had never been about my mother. Not really. She wasn't the primary target. She was leverage. A distraction. Part of something larger. Something that led directly back to me. That night, David arrived home smiling. As if nothing had changed. As if he hadn't spent years secretly documenting my life. As if he wasn't hiding entire archives behind locked doors. As if my name wasn't sitting at the top of a list labeled Phase 2. And when he kissed me on the cheek, I finally understood the most frightening truth of all. I wasn't investigating my husband anymore. I was investigating a man who had been investigating me. For years. But the next morning, a single phone call would reveal why he started watching me before we were ever married. And that reason would connect to a secret buried 26 years in the past. A secret my mother had never told me. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more psychological dramas that keep you guessing until the very end. Because the truth behind David's obsession was far older. And far darker than I ever imagined. The phone call came at 8:17 the next morning. I was standing in my kitchen staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. My nerves were stretched so thin I jumped when the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded different. Tighter. Older somehow. Can you come over? No explanation. No small talk. Just those 4 words. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I knew she already knew something was wrong. 20 minutes later, I sat across from her dining room table. The same table where she had helped Emily with homework. The same table where birthday cakes had been cut. The same table where she was about to dismantle everything I thought I knew about our family. She looked exhausted. As though she hadn't slept. As though she had spent the night fighting ghosts. Then she said something that stopped my heart. David isn't the first person who's looked for you. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that changes lives. What does that mean? She lowered her eyes. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother looked afraid. The story began 26 years earlier. Before David. Before my marriage. Before almost everything. I learned that when I was 2 years old, my father had become involved in a financial fraud investigation. Nothing violent. Nothing glamorous. Just greed. Money. Lies. Several wealthy investors lost everything. Families were destroyed. Lives unraveled. My father cooperated with authorities. People went to prison. But one family blamed him for everything. And according to my mother, they never truly let it go. Years passed and the case disappeared from headlines. The people involved scattered. Life moved on. Or so she believed. Until strange things started happening. Small things. Harmless things. Questions from strangers. Unexpected calls. People asking about our address. People asking about me. At the time, she dismissed it. But eventually it stopped. Or seemed to. Why didn't you tell me? My voice cracked. She looked away. Because I thought it was over. And perhaps she had. Perhaps she wanted to believe it. Because parents don't always tell lies to deceive. Sometimes they lie because the truth is terrifying. I told her about the storage unit, the photographs, the files, the ledger, the lists, everything. By the time I finished, all the color had drained from her face. Then she whispered something I will never forget. David wasn't looking for us. I stared at her, confused. What? She swallowed hard. He was looking for someone connected to us. That statement haunted me all the way home. Because if she was right, then David's obsession wasn't personal. At least not originally. Which meant there had to be another beginning. Another reason. Another connection. And somewhere inside that connection was the truth. That evening I did something I should have done sooner. I hired a private investigator. Not because I trusted him completely, but because I no longer trusted myself. I needed facts. Not fear. Facts. 3 days later he called. And his first sentence changed everything. We found David's real name. I nearly dropped the phone. Real name? What are you talking about? The investigator explained that 20 years earlier, David had legally changed his identity. Not for criminal reasons. Not to evade warrants. Not to disappear. But to distance himself from a family name. A family connected to the exact fraud case my mother described. I felt physically sick. The room spinning around me. Because suddenly the pieces aligned. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to see the outline. Enough to recognize the shape. Enough to understand that my husband had entered my life carrying secrets long before he ever met me. The investigator continued. David's father had lost everything during that scandal. Money. Status. Relationships. Eventually his health. The bitterness became family mythology. A story passed from one generation to another. A story about blame. A story about injustice. A story about who supposedly ruined their lives. My family. But something still didn't make sense. If revenge was the goal, why wait so long? Why marry me, Elle? Why build a life? Why spend 12 years creating what looked like genuine love? The answer came from somewhere unexpected. David himself. That night I finally confronted him. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just honestly. When he entered the kitchen, I was already waiting. The ledger sat on the table. The photographs beside it. The storage unit documents spread between us. No more secrets. No more pretending. He stopped walking, looked down, and immediately knew. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down. Quietly. Like a man exhausted from carrying something heavy. How much do you know? Wasn't denial. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't surprise. Just resignation. Enough. The word barely left my mouth. He nodded, then stared out the window. For a very long time. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. You think this started as revenge? I said nothing. Maybe it did. Another long silence. But somewhere along the way, his eyes found mine. I forgot what I was supposed to be doing. I wish I could tell you that explanation made everything better. It didn't. Because some wounds aren't healed by honesty. Some wounds exist because honesty arrived too late. David admitted he had entered my life carrying anger he inherited from other people. Anger that wasn't truly his. At first he gathered information. Watched from a distance. Learned about my family. The same way he had been taught. The same way he had watched others do. But life complicated the plan. Because real people are harder to hate than stories. And over time, his obsession transformed. Not into love exactly. Not at first. Something messier. Something unhealthy. Something that blurred the line between attachment and control. The ledger wasn't a murder plan. The investigator eventually confirmed that. The names represented people connected to long-term grievance files. Targets of observation. Not violence. The language was disturbing. The behavior was disturbing. But the feared crimes were never actually carried out. Still, that truth didn't erase what happened. Because being watched for years is its own violation. Being documented without consent is its own betrayal. The red circle around my mother's name? It wasn't because she was next. It was because she knew the most about the past. The most likely person to expose connections David wanted hidden. And my name at the top of Phase 2? That was worse. Because it revealed the final truth. Phase 2 wasn't about destroying me. It was about controlling the narrative if I ever discovered everything. Preparing responses. Preparing explanations. Preparing defenses. Preparing for this exact moment. Months later, we separated. Quietly. Respectfully. There were no screaming matches. No dramatic courtroom scenes. Just consequences. Real ones. The kind adults face when trust breaks beyond repair. Some people asked if I hated him. The honest answer? No. Hatred would have been easier. What I felt was grief. Grief for a marriage that was partly real and partly built on secrets. Grief for years I couldn't fully understand anymore. Grief for the version of him I thought I knew. As for my mother, she finally stopped carrying a secret she'd protected for decades. And surprisingly, that brought us closer. Not because the truth was pleasant, but because truth removes distance. Even painful truth. Sometimes people ask what the biggest lesson was. It wasn't that monsters hide in plain sight. Life is rarely that simple. The lesson was this. People don't become dangerous only because of what they do. Sometimes they become dangerous because of the stories they refuse to let go of. Stories inherited. Stories repeated. Stories carried so long they become identities. And if those stories go unchallenged, they can quietly shape entire lives. The last time I saw David, he looked older. Human. Not the villain I imagined when I first opened that ledger. Not the husband I believed I knew either. Just a flawed man standing inside the consequences of his choices. And me? I finally stopped looking over my shoulder. Not because I had all the answers, but because I no longer needed them. Some mysteries deserve solving. Others deserve leaving behind. And that was one of them.